Hey everyone, Cindy here. So in response to my last video about why we should stop using the word minority when referring to historically underrepresented identity groups, I got some DMs and comments about the term BIPOC, otherwise known as Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So I wanted to share some insights on the term BIPOC and why it is being largely embraced today, and maybe help you consider incorporating it into your own vocabulary. So the language of diversity and inclusion is ever evolving, and because of that, there are always going to be emerging trends in language. And BIPOC has certainly been a term that has popped up in the landscape of DEI language in the last, I would say, 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, and there's a reason for that. And so BIPOC is intended to be used instead of the term people of color. And that's because the term people of color really generalizes and clumps all experiences of very many different communities of color into one term and one label. Another issue with the term people of color is that it doesn't acknowledge the oppressive history and experiences of Black Americans and Indigenous people in this country. Which I think is really important to acknowledge. And so the term people of color is, we're trying to leave that term behind so that we can acknowledge the individual experiences, identities, and histories of Black and Indigenous people. And so we really want to stay away from that one-size-fits-all thinking, because that one-size-fits-all thinking can help to perpetuate stereotypes that already exist in this country. Another reason why we should leave people of color behind is because racism affects all communities of color differently. The idea that communities of color are all affected by racism equally is problematic, and well, it's just wrong. If you look at the history of Native Americans were here before anyone. This is their land. However, they were not even granted citizenship until 1924. They experienced genocide and displacement of their own communities, and they weren't even given the right to vote in all 50 states until 1962. If you look at anti-Blackness and the history of Black people in this country, we can start from 1619 with the beginning of slavery, and Black Americans experienced almost 250 years of enslavement, and then they had to experience another 100 years of Jim Crow. Which all affected these communities and still affect these communities in some regards today. And so this isn't to say that other communities of color have not experienced institutionalized or systemic racism and oppression, because they have. It's just to acknowledge that the level of oppression is different with Black Americans and Indigenous Americans. The term people of color should be left behind also because it works to re-strengthen and center whiteness. And so when, language, first of all, is really powerful and words matter. And when we only have 2 words to identify all racial groups, it can be problematic, especially when we have one word, white people, to identify one racial group, but then we have another word, people of color, to clump a variety of racial groups into one term, right? And so these terms in itself can help you understand how powerful language is. And when we use people of color to clump so many different racial groups into one category, yet we're using white people, one word, to clump just one racial identity group and explain their experiences, then through language, what we're doing is we're working to re-strengthen and center whiteness. The term people of color also helps other communities of color, non-Black communities of color, to deny anti-Blackness that might exist within their own communities. And so when somebody like me, who's South Asian, is forced to think about how my experiences are different than Black and Indigenous people, then it really encourages me to think about my own history and the histories of other communities of color and the history specifically around oppression and racism. And it also encourages me to just identify myself differently, so that when I think about biases and how I might perpetuate my biases onto other racial groups, I can easily identify my own conscious and both subconscious anti-Black biases that I might have. And so, in conclusion, when we leave people of color behind and we adopt BIPOC, Black, Indigenous People of Color, then we're really working to acknowledge and identify the unique history, identities, and the oppressive experiences that both Black Americans and Indigenous Americans have endured in this country. And we're also working to advance racial justice. And so I encourage you to think critically about labels and words and terms that you use when identifying different racial groups. And I encourage you to adopt the term BIPOC into your vocabulary and leave people of color behind with history. Thank you for listening.